I was sitting in a hard vinyl chair in the surgical waiting room when my daughter walked in, still wearing her running clothes, and before she even looked at me, she said, "Don't think for 1 second you're getting a say in Marcus's business, Walter. That company is mine now. I'd start looking for a lawyer if I were you, because I'm not asking twice." She hadn't even asked if her husband was still breathing when she said it. My son-in-law of 12 years had just come out of a 7-hour emergency surgery after a fall at a construction site he owned. A fall nobody could quite explain yet, and his wife's first move was to threaten his own father-in-law over money before the anesthesia had even worn off him. If you're just finding this story, take a breath, because what I found out over the following weeks changed everything I believed about the woman my son-in-law married. If you've ever had someone assume your quiet nature meant you were foolish, hit like right now. Tell me, neighbor, where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It helps this old man know who's out there listening. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a fire investigator for the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the last 11 of those as the department's lead arson specialist. I know how to read a room after something's gone wrong in it. I know how to look at char patterns and burn trails and figure out what really happened when everyone around me is telling a different story. I retired 4 years ago, moved into a small house with a garden out back, and told myself my working days of picking apart other people's disasters were over. My daughter Renee married Marcus Ford 9 years ago. Marcus was the kind of man you don't meet twice in a lifetime. Patient, hardworking, the sort of son-in-law who called just to ask how your knee was doing. He'd built a mid-sized construction and development company from a single crew and a used pickup truck into something worth close to $40 million. Contracts all over the state, his name on buildings people drove past every day. He trusted people too easily. He always had. And he had never once, in 9 years, looked twice at his wife Renee with anything but devotion. Even though I'd started to notice things about her that made the old investigator in me uneasy. The fluorescent lights in that hospital hallway buzzed the way they always do, a thin electric hum that gets under your skin after enough hours. I'd been in that waiting room since 4 in the morning, since the call came that Marcus had gone off a 4th-floor scaffold at the Brookhaven site, a fall that by every account should have killed him outright. I watched surgeons move in and out with their masks pulled down around their necks, heard the low murmur of nurses trading updates I wasn't allowed to hear because I wasn't next of kin. And when Renee finally walked through those doors, dry-eyed, freshly showered, her hair still damp and combed, not a hint of the panic a wife should carry, I felt something cold settle into my chest before she'd said a single word. She said her piece about the company and turned to leave, heels clicking against the tile. And it was only then, watching her walk away without so much as glancing at the surgical doors, that I understood I was looking at a woman who already knew the outcome of that surgery before the doctors did. I didn't argue with her. I've learned in 3 decades of investigation work that the moment you tip your hand, the evidence disappears. I sat back down in that hard vinyl chair, folded my hands, and let my face go slack, let my shoulders round the way an old man's shoulders round when he's given up. I let her see exactly what she wanted to see. A tired, harmless father-in-law who'd fold the second real pressure was applied. Inside, though, the part of my mind that had spent 31 years walking through burned buildings looking for the one detail that didn't belong was already working. Marcus survived the surgery, but survived is a generous word for it. He came out of it in a medically induced coma, machines doing his breathing for him, his brain swelling from the impact in a way the neurosurgeon described to me in the hallway, quietly, out of Renee's earshot, as extremely serious with an uncertain outcome. Renee didn't stay past that first evening. She said the stress was making her sick, that she needed to be home, needed to handle things at the company, needed to keep Ford construction and development running while her husband lay hooked to machines 2 floors above the lobby she was walking out of. I stayed. I stayed every single night for the first week, sleeping in that chair, watching my son-in-law's chest rise and fall on a ventilator. And in that silence I started remembering things I'd let myself ignore for years because Marcus was happy, and it wasn't my place. I remembered the business partner, a slick, expensively dressed man named Derek Colson, who Marcus had brought on 18 months earlier to help manage the company's rapid growth, and how Derek and Renee always seemed to end a room's conversation the moment Marcus walked into it. I remembered a family barbecue 8 months back where I'd caught Renee's phone lighting up with a message from a contact saved only as D, and the way she'd turned the screen face down so fast she'd nearly knocked over her wine. I remembered Marcus mentioning, almost as an aside, that Derek had convinced him to shift the company's operating accounts and equipment insurance to a new financial group, one Derek had personally vetted, and how Marcus, trusting to a fault, hadn't asked a single follow-up question. By the second week, with Marcus stable but unresponsive, I told Renee I needed to go home and rest, that an old man's back couldn't take much more of that chair. She looked almost relieved. She told me to take care of myself, kissed my cheek with lips that never once seemed to have shed a tear, and went back to running her husband's company as though she'd been groomed for the job her entire life. I didn't go home to rest. I went home, and I called an old contact of mine, a private investigator named Walt Higgins who'd worked arson cases alongside me for 20 years before going independent. A man I trusted the way you trust someone who's seen you at your worst and never said a word about it. I told him what I needed. Financial records, any permits, any inspection reports, anything filed on the Brookhaven site in the last 6 months, and I told him to be careful, because if I was even half right about what I suspected, the people involved had already proven they weren't afraid to let a man fall. 4 stories. It took Walt 11 days to bring me the first piece that mattered. A safety inspection report filed on the Brookhaven scaffold system, dated 3 weeks before Marcus's fall, flagging a structural deficiency in the very platform he'd gone off of. The report had been filed correctly, through the proper channels, by the site foreman, and then it had simply vanished from the company's internal compliance system, replaced with a clean report showing no deficiencies at all, signed off using Marcus's own digital credentials, on a day Marcus had been 300 miles away at a supplier conference in Dallas. Someone with access to his login had signed off on a report he never saw, clearing a scaffold system that had already been flagged as unsafe, 4 days before he fell from it. I sat at my kitchen table with that report in front of me, and I felt my hands go still in the particular way they used to go still at a fire scene, right before I found the point of origin. This wasn't an accident. This was a stage set for one. I went back to the hospital every day after that, careful to play the same tired, harmless old man Renee had already dismissed. I brought Marcus's favorite radio station in on a little speaker, even though the doctors said there was no guarantee he could hear it, because some old part of me believed a man might find his way back toward a familiar sound. And it was on one of those visits, sitting beside his bed in the quiet hum of the ICU, that a young nurse named Priya, who'd taken a liking to the old man who never missed a visit, mentioned something in passing that she likely didn't realize the weight of. She said Renee had come in alone, late one night before I'd started staying regularly, and had asked the attending physician a strange question. Not how her husband was doing, not what his chances were. She'd asked how long a man could remain in that condition before a court would consider guardianship transfer automatic. She had been planning for his death, or worse, his permanent incapacity, from very nearly the first hour. I started spending my nights at Marcus's own house instead of my own, using the excuse that I was watering Renee's garden while she stayed busy at the office, a lie she accepted without a second thought because it fit exactly who she believed I was. Marcus had a home office off the back of the house, a converted sunroom with a roll-top desk that had been his grandfather's, and it was there, on the third night, going through drawers I told myself I had every right to be in as his father-in-law and emergency contact, that I found the flash drive taped to the underside of that desk. It was labeled, in Marcus's own careful handwriting, with nothing but a date. 6 weeks before his fall, my hands were shaking by the time I got it into my old laptop back at my own house, the same way they used to shake right before I confirmed an accelerant pattern in a fire that everyone else was calling faulty wiring. The drive held financial statements Marcus had apparently started pulling together himself, quietly, on his own, comparing the numbers Derek had been reporting to the board against the actual bank records from the new financial group Derek had steered him toward. There was a gap, a significant one, nearly $9 million routed through a shell entity registered in Renee's maiden name, funneled out of company equipment and insurance accounts over the past year, under the label of expedited supplier payments that no supplier had ever received. And there was one more file. A video, recorded on Marcus's own phone, dated 4 days before his fall. The same day the falsified safety report had been signed with his stolen credentials. He was sitting in that same roll-top desk chair, tired, his tie loosened, speaking directly into the camera in a low, careful voice, the voice of a man who suspects something terrible and is trying to be responsible about it before he says it out loud to anyone who might panic. He said he'd found irregularities in the company accounts that traced back to Derek and, he believed, to Renee. He said if anything ever happened to him, anyone watching this should know exactly where to look. He named the shell entity. He named the financial group. And in the last 10 seconds of that recording, his voice cracked, just slightly, and he said, "I don't want to believe it, but I have to be honest with what the numbers are telling me." He had known, somehow in some quiet corner of his own mind, my son-in-law had known his wife might be capable of this, and he had documented it anyway, carefully, like a man laying groundwork for a truth he prayed he'd never need. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn with that flash drive in front of me, and for the first time since the surgical waiting room, I let myself feel the full weight of what had actually happened to my son-in-law. Then, the way I always did at a fire scene once the grief passed and the work began, I made myself calm and precise, because rage gets you nothing in an investigation. Precision gets you everything. I called Walt back the next morning and told him what I'd found, and together, we spent the following 3 weeks building the case Marcus himself had started. Walt tracked the shell entity's formation documents and found the registered agent's address matched a small law office Derek had used for 2 other ventures. I went back through years of old company Christmas photos and family gatherings, looking with fresh eyes at every interaction between Renee and Derek, and found a pattern that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, hidden behind the ordinary noise of a busy company and a busy family. I even found, buried in an old group email chain from company events, a scanned copy of a corporate insurance policy Marcus had increased 8 months earlier at Derek's specific recommendation, a policy that would pay out an extraordinary sum in the event of his death or permanent disability, with Renee listed as primary beneficiary and full inheritor of his ownership stake. Marcus had built a company worth $40 million, and in doing so, he had also built, without ever meaning to, the exact motive someone might need to end him. While I worked, I kept playing my part. I let Renee see an old man who came by to sit at his son-in-law's bedside and ask meek, useless questions about the business he no longer had any stake in. I let her hand me paperwork to sign as an emergency contact without reading it closely in front of her. I let Derek shake my hand at the hospital once, that same slick, confident grip, and say how terrible this all was for the family, how he was doing everything he could to keep the company steady during such a difficult time, all while I stood there with the knowledge in my chest that I could have had him arrested on the spot if the case had been ready. It wasn't ready yet, and rushing it would only give them time to disappear the money, or worse, decide that a man who wasn't recovering fast enough might need help along the way. Marcus began to stabilize in his 4th week in the hospital, breathing on his own, his brain activity slowly, cautiously improving, though he remained unconscious. The doctors called it a guarded but hopeful prognosis. Renee, when she heard the word hopeful, did not look relieved. I watched her face very closely when the doctor said it, the way you watch a suspect's face when you tell them the fire marshal found something interesting near the electrical panel. And for one unguarded half-second, something crossed her expression that wasn't hope at all. It was calculation. That was the moment I understood we didn't have much time left before she moved to consolidate everything permanently, whatever that meant. I called a federal contact Walt had connected me with, a white-collar crimes investigator named Special Agent Denise Callahan, who worked embezzlement and insurance fraud cases out of the regional office, and I laid the entire case in front of her over one long afternoon in her office. The falsified safety report signed with stolen credentials, the $9 million in diverted funds, the shell entity in Renee's maiden name, Marcus's own recorded testimony naming his suspicions 4 days before his fall, the insurance policy increase engineered by Derek 8 months prior. Agent Callahan listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair and told me it was the most complete case a family member had ever walked into her office holding, ready-built, evidence chain intact. She asked me if I was prepared for what came next, because once federal agents moved on a case like this, there was no quiet, gentle way to do it. I told her I'd spent 31 years walking into the aftermath of things that had already burned to the ground. I could handle watching it happen once, on purpose, to the people who deserved it. The board of directors meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, called by Renee herself, to formally transfer full executive authority and ownership control over to her, using a medical power of attorney she claimed Marcus had signed years earlier, conveniently broad enough to cover exactly this situation, conveniently notarized by an associate of Derek's. I made sure, through channels Renee never suspected an old retired fire investigator would have, that I received an invitation as Marcus's father-in-law, and listed emergency contact, to be present in a show of family unity. I walked into that boardroom that Thursday morning wearing the same soft gray cardigan I'd worn to the hospital every day for 6 weeks. The same tired, stooped posture Renee had long since stopped paying attention to. The room was full. The board members, the company's senior directors, Renee at the head of the long table in a dark, tasteful suit that somehow still managed to look like morning wear, Derek standing just behind her right shoulder in a navy blazer, wearing the same easy confidence I imagine he'd worn his entire life, the confidence of a man who'd never once been made to answer for anything. Renee spoke about Marcus with a trembling, rehearsed sorrow, about his brilliant vision for the company, about how deeply this tragedy had affected her, about how she believed, with her whole heart, that continuing his legacy meant she needed full and immediate authority to steady the company during this uncertain time. Derek stepped forward with the power of attorney documents, laid them on the table, and began explaining the transfer of executive control in that same smooth, practiced baritone men, like him, always seemed to have ready. The board members nodded along, none of them aware of the $9 million quietly missing from the very accounts they were about to formally hand over full unsupervised control of. Renee reached for the pen. That was the moment I stood up. I didn't shuffle. I didn't stoop. I straightened my spine the way I used to straighten it, walking into a scene that everyone else had already decided was an accident, and I said, in a voice that hadn't been in that room in 6 weeks, that this meeting was over. The doors opened behind me, and Agent Callahan walked in with 3 federal agents at her back, their badges out, their presence immediately silencing the room. I set a small case on the table, the same table Renee's pen was still hovering over, and inside it were printed copies of the falsified safety report. The financial trail Walt and I had spent 3 weeks building, and a tablet, already queued up, holding a single video file. I told the room they needed to see it before anyone signed anything. I pressed play, and Marcus's tired, careful voice filled that boardroom, naming the shell entity, naming Derek, naming his own quiet fear about what his wife might be capable of, recorded 4 days before a scaffold that had already been flagged unsafe somehow cleared inspection under his stolen digital signature. Renee's pen slipped from her fingers and hit the table with a small, sharp sound that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. I watched the color drain out of her face the way I've watched color drain out of 100 faces standing in front of the wreckage of something they'd built and then destroyed. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in 6 weeks, and I don't think she recognized the man standing there at all. Derek broke first. He always was going to. Men like Derek are loyal exactly until the moment loyalty stops being profitable. And the instant he saw the federal badges and understood the video had named him specifically, he took one step back from Renee, physically separated himself from her at the table, and began talking. He said the embezzlement had been her plan from the start, that he'd only helped manage the money because she'd threatened to expose an unrelated affair he'd had if he didn't cooperate, that he had never, not once, discussed anything about Marcus's fall, that whatever had happened at that scaffold he wanted no part of and knew nothing about. Renee's composure didn't crack from Derek's betrayal. It cracked when Agent Callahan stepped forward and told her they had also obtained the maintenance logs for the scaffold lift system, logs showing it had been serviced by a contractor 2 days before Marcus's fall, a contractor with no record of ever having worked for the company before, paid in cash, from an account traced back to the same shell entity in her name. She started screaming then, that this was all a fabrication, that her husband's own father was clearly having some kind of breakdown from grief, that we'd manufactured evidence, that she wanted a lawyer, that none of this proved anything about the fall itself. The board members sat in stunned, frozen silence, watching the woman they'd been about to hand $40 million to unravel completely in front of them. The agents moved in and read her rights while she was still shouting, and as they led her toward the door, she twisted back one final time to look at me, mascara running, all of that composed, camera-ready grief finally, truly real for the first time since her husband had gone off that scaffold, and she said my name, begged me to stop this, said we could still work it out as a family. I walked toward her slowly, the way I used to walk the last few steps toward a confirmed point of origin, and I leaned in close enough that only she could hear me. "You told me not to expect a penny," I said. "You were right. I don't want a penny. I want you to spend the next 20 years somewhere you'll have plenty of time to think about what you did to him." Marcus opened his eyes for the first time 3 weeks later, slow and confused, in a hospital room I'd made sure was quiet, familiar, and entirely free of anyone who didn't love him. It took him time to understand everything that had happened while he slept. Time I sat beside him for, filling in the pieces gently. The way you tell someone about a fire that's already been put out, focusing first on the fact that he was safe now, that it was over, before he had to hear the rest. He wept when I told him about the video he'd recorded, about how his own careful, quiet instincts, the ones he'd been almost embarrassed to act on, had ultimately saved his company and helped put his wife behind bars. He wept harder when I told him Renee and Derek had both been convicted, 6 months later, on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and, for Renee specifically, attempted murder. Once investigators confirmed the scaffold sabotage had been deliberate, they're each serving lengthy federal sentences now, in separate facilities, having turned on each other so completely in their respective trials that neither one has spoken to the other since the arrest. Marcus recovered, slowly, over the better part of a year, relearning how to walk steady, how to trust his own balance again in more ways than one. He took back full control of Ford Construction and Development with my help and Agent Callahan's guidance, recovered nearly all of the $9 million from frozen accounts, and rebuilt the company's leadership from the ground up with people he'd vetted himself this time, carefully, the way I'd taught him, without ever quite meaning to teach him anything. He asked me, about a year after he woke up, why I hadn't just told him what I suspected the moment I found that flash drive. I told him the truth, that I'd spent 31 years learning that the moment you show your hand too early, the fire finishes burning before you ever find out what started it, that I loved him enough to be patient and loved him enough to be ruthless, and that those two things had never once felt like a contradiction to me. These days, Marcus comes by my house most Sundays, sits with me in the garden, and we don't talk about any of it much anymore. He's remarried now, to a woman named Claire who works as a physical therapist, and who looked at me the very first time we met with the kind of open, easy warmth that told me everything I needed to know about her character in about 4 seconds flat, the exact opposite of the unease I'd felt the first time I ever shook Renee's hand. Marcus set aside a portion of the recovered funds to establish a construction safety fund in his own name, providing independent third-party safety inspections, free of charge, to smaller construction firms who can't afford proper oversight on their own, so that no other family ever loses someone to a scaffold that was quietly, deliberately, made unsafe by someone who was supposed to love them. I think about that hospital hallway sometimes, the fluorescent hum, the cold vinyl chair, the sound of Renee's heels clicking away from her husband's surgical doors before she even knew if he'd live. I think about how easy it is for people to mistake an old man's quiet for weakness, to look at gray hair and a slow walk and assume there's nothing sharp left underneath. There's a lesson in that I never get tired of learning myself. The people who hurt us the worst are so often the ones who believed, right up until the very end, that we'd never notice. And the ones who love us the most sometimes leave us exactly what we need to find the truth, quietly, carefully, taped to the underside of a desk, waiting for someone patient enough to look. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, the way Renee underestimated me? Tell me about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear it.